Hello, this lecture is about the Democratic Republic of the Congo and various people groups within the DRC. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what we're looking at here is, once again, a map of Africa. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is seen here in the center. So just to give you a little bit of an understanding of where we are, we're also in Central Africa, slightly towards the south. So the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Congo River are spelled with the letter C, as you can see here, DRC. The Congo culture, which we're going to be looking at soon, and the kingdom and the language, which is called Kikongo, are spelled with a K, not a C. And between 1971 and 1997, the DRC was called the Republic of Zaire. So just a very, very brief background. It was the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1960. So this was the Belgian Congo, and I have mentioned this in class. The Ghost of King Leopold's Ghost, is a book on the subject. The King of Belgium wanted to exploit the DRC for its natural resources, particularly, I believe, rubber and ivory. And over the course of roughly 25 years, from 1885 to 1908, approximately 10 million people died under his reign. It was extraordinarily brutal. He would punish people who did not meet their quotas by severing their noses or their hands or their feet, even small children, and just truly, truly horrific. He would chain and torture the women while their husbands went into the forest to collect the rubber. And so the reason that it's not exactly known, it's between 5 and 10 million people who died. So part of this has to do with people fleeing their villages. And so going into the bush and dying of starvation, but also the lack of having children, right? So the population diminished in that way also. But again, 1885 to 1908. This is just over 100 years ago, 125 years ago. It is very recent, very truly horrific. But I would still highly recommend the book, King Leopold's Ghost. It is very sobering without being as disturbing as the subject matter could be. So in 1960, the Congo Free State gains its independence. King Leopold was only in charge until 1908. And so there's been a long history of dictators, and then those dictators being toppled. So Patrice Lumumba was a freedom fighter at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. He was associated with the Soviet Union during the Cold War and became prime minister for a year. But then he was executed by the US, and that was the very early 1960s. And the US goes ahead and sets someone else on the throne who rules from 1965 to 1997. This is the individual who changes the country's name to Zaire. And then he's overthrown by yet another person who renames it the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 97. He's assassinated in 2001. He is elected and then he's overthrown. So there's a lot of turmoil politically in this area. And it is far from over. So the international community still recognizes someone who is not currently the president. So a couple of things. So first of all, I know that you were reading about the Congo religion and various symbolic elements of that, and also the incorporation of Christianity. So one of the cosmological beliefs that we're going to be seeing a lot of, both in the Democratic Republic of the Congo generally, as well as within the Congo peoples, is this concept of the 4 moments of the sun. And this is a cosmological belief that follows the sun as it moves through the day. So think about, right, you have the earth, the sun comes up, and then eventually goes down. So the 4 moments of the sun is cyclical, and it relates to the cardinal directions, so north, south, east, and west. Sunrise is birth, so it's associated with the east. The prime of life is midday or the north. In the setting sun, this represents an older person, and this is in the west. And then night is death, and this is in the south. And in between these worlds, there's a watery middle world called the Kalunga. And this cosmological belief, the 4 moments of the sun, is represented by the gesture that you see here. One arm up, one arm down. Excuse me. So what we're looking at is called a mutsidi, and this is from the Bembe peoples. As you can see here, this is a reliquary mannequin. So hopefully by now you are remembering that reliquary objects, relics are human remains that have been preserved in order to honor and venerate these objects. So what we're seeing here is relatively small. It's 47 by 33 centimeters. So 47, hang on, quick math here. Yeah, so it's about 1.5 feet tall. This contains the bones of deceased important ancestors. The word mutsidi means mannequin. And so what we're seeing here is a mannequin or a humanoid figure that contains the relics. So this is essentially a portable grave site. So last week we looked at the Kota and the Fang peoples, and the fact that because they were nomadic, they couldn't have one central location where they buried individuals. They needed to have portable grave sites. We see something similar here. And these creations, they can look like a doll, but they are not a doll. It's more appropriate to call these a soft sculpture. And these are made by the priest or the nganga. So again, this is someone who is able to manipulate the spiritual forces within the world and is able to harness some of that power. So the nganga makes this, and the inside of this is a cane armature. So the basic structure is made with cane, and then the bones are placed inside this, and then dried banana leaves are used as stuffing. This is only utilized for important figures such as chiefs, kings, and women with many children. So this is not something that everyone gets. The body is originally buried in the ground, and then once the flesh has decayed, the body is exhumed, and select bones are chosen and placed within this reliquary figure. The creation of this figure occurs during a ceremony. And the reason that something like this would be made is because the ancestor has appeared to someone, which indicates the need for one of these mutsidi or reliquary repositories, or because the town wants to venerate someone. And these objects would be kept in a grave house. So they will be brought out only to settle issues or in times of need. These are not something that are readily visible to everyone at any point in time. They tend to be covered with red or blue cotton cloth. Red equals power. And the gesture is, again, right, this 4 moments of the sun. This is also seen as the crossroads, right? So the connection of the living and the less visible world. This sign, this gesture, is associated with kings and chiefs. So you have the power of life over life and death. Okay, so think about what these 4 moments mean. You have the prime of life, you have death, birth, and old age. And the sky god this gesture has long been associated with the sky god. And we can see this emphasis on the crossroads today in voodoo. And this was something that was kept throughout the transatlantic slave trade. So hopefully you are remembering that we've talked about crossroads and how this plays into voodoo in the past. And if you'll remember, that was when we were looking at the Yoruba people in Nigeria, as well as the Kingdom of Benin, also in Nigeria. And in the 1st century CE, there was a migration of people from Nigeria to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So there are a lot of similarities between the religions of the Yoruba people and the Edo people, people from the Kingdom of Benin, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, specifically the Congo with a K people. So there are a lot of similarities there. So again, you have this gesture, which will come up again, this concept of the crossroads, in a few weeks when we look at voodoo. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the religion voodoo is actually voodoo, and it is significantly different from what we associate with voodoo here in the West. So we'll get to talk about that in a bit. The average person is buried horizontally. So for someone to be seated indicates that they are a noble person, such as a king or a chief, etc. But again, this is only about 1.5 feet tall. So it wouldn't take up that much space, even though it is buried upright. And the individual who creates this, the Nganga, is a diviner, an herbal specialist. So someone who's able to use the power within natural objects like plants, as well as a priest and a healer. And the Nganga will often have kaolin, which is the white kind of clayish substance around the eyes, because white is the color of the dead. And this indicates that he is all-seeing and can see into the spiritual, world. So here we have a Mutsidi figure. Okay. Another one, you may notice that there are some characteristics that we've kind of talked about in the past, right? This emphasis on the stomach, particularly the belly button. You can see that the belly button is really emphasized here. So again, that connection back to the ancestors. Okay, and again, right, this is not an example of African proportions as defined by William Fagg, which is where the head is 1/4 to 1/3 of the overall size of the body. This is because in this society, the stomach is what is important. That is the seat of the soul and not the head. Here's another Mutsidi. Again, these are all from the 20th century, relatively early. But you can see once again this gesture, the 4 moments of the sun. Okay, so next up is something of a very similar process. So this is called the Nyombo, and this is from the Bwende people. And this one is miniature. It's 60 centimeters, which is, I'm pulling up a calculator, 2 feet tall. So this one is miniature. And the Nyombo fulfills a very similar role as the Mutsidi. So once again, we see the cane armature, but this one is significantly different in that the body is not buried and then exhumed and select bones taken from the body and placed in the reliquary figure. In this case, the entire body is dried using smoke, then wrapped in raffia, and then placed within this cane armature and wrapped with cloth, etc. You'll often see red cloth utilized, and this has to do with the red blankets that were brought by British traders in the 19th century and were worn by chiefs as a symbol of power. So the this figure that we looked at is 60 centimeters. This one is 180. It's 3 times the size. So this is, let's see, 6 feet tall. Okay, this is extremely large. And as you can see from some of these images, These are over life size. So here you have a miniature Nyambo, like the first object that we saw, but then this would be for a regular full-size Nyambo. And this is the creator of the work pictured with parts of the works. So to give you an idea, these are massive. Okay, so this is the body, and it is brought to an upright position and then carried to its grave. And you can see how huge it is. And it has these bolts of cloth thrown over its shoulders as an example of prestige and conspicuous consumption. These are massive and they are buried standing. Okay, so think about all the work that would go into preparing the body for this, and then preparing the enclosure for the body, this figure. Again, these are not dolls. Placing the body within it, sealing it, carrying it to the grave site, and digging a grave. So these people are not nomadic, so it makes sense that these objects can be buried. They are able to have a geographic location for their ancestor veneration. And these objects, these Nyambo, are painted with codified signs. So it's a way to communicate with the ancestors. So it provides the identity of the individual whose essentially grave this is, right? So these patterns indicate to the ancestors who the person is, because the people who are still living want the ancestors to recognize those symbols and to understand and accept the person. So the individual who's recently deceased, the one who's within the Nyombo, is able to help the living. And so you want the individual in the Nyombo to be able to connect with the ancestors who are long deceased, and then they can act as an intermediary and help the living. Within the Congo peoples, only a king can wear a diamond pattern like what you see here, which has links to various symbols of kingly power. You'll often see that these figures have the sign of the crossroads, the 4 moments of the sun symbol or gesture, one arm up, one arm down. And these would be commissioned before death, but they're only for the most famous and powerful of people, right? So again, think about how much work this would take, and it makes sense why not everyone can have one of these. They're not exactly portraits, but they do have various identifying marks that would match the individual who was recently deceased. So as I mentioned, right, these are to help the ancestors identify the recently deceased, but they also would depict instances of scarification if an individual had any, etc. Any tattoos, that sort of thing. These aren't exactly portraits, as I mentioned, but most of them do have their mouths open with their teeth displayed. This indicates that they are speaking to the ancestors in the other world. Again, the stomach is the site of the soul in this belief system, and so the belly button and the stomach are very prominent. And having these large objects, these massive, massive graves, as well as the symbols here, communicates the faith of the community and shows the power of the deceased. And many times they will have lines under the eyes that are diagonal, and these indicate the tears. They can either be white, again, color of the dead, or black. And if they're white, they are made of kaolin. And the what these tears indicate is this quote: "Go with our tears wet upon your face and present our problems among the dead. Be our medium." Okay, so this is not someone who has died and is no longer able to represent their people, etc. This is someone who is very much still a figure of power, someone to be reckoned with. Again, acting as an intermediary between the people and the ancestors. So you can see here that there are lines under the eyes. Again, these would be the tears to indicate grief. This is, I believe, a woman. So she probably had many children and was a pillar of her community. Again, this is not something that anyone can obtain. It is only reserved for the most powerful and important of figures in the community. One thing that I would like to point out is that this is from the early 20th century, prior to 1934. Excuse me. And it does contain human remains. So think about how this object would have been obtained. Okay, this is big. This is not like one of the reliquary bundles or even the mutsidi, which could be taken and hidden away. This is something that would require a lot of work. And this figure was likely buried, which means that the people who took this is in Sweden. So the people who took this would have, in all likelihood, exhumed this. So here in the West, we really frown upon grave robbery. So just think about what is necessary in order for us to be able to see an object like this. To be able to photograph these objects is one thing. We're seeing them here in their community of origin. They're being honored, they're being processed, but to be able to see what this procession looks like versus to actually see the object itself is very different, and this is a huge violation. Okay, so again, right, this idea of where does our need to know stop, and where do we start to respect the rights of someone else? Do we have the right to display human remains in a museum? Okay, so I would like you to think about these things, right? You won't come up with an answer. There is no right answer. But I think that there are arguments that can be made, very strong arguments. Okay, so again, Nyambo, very, very large. You can see the size. I didn't realize I had so many pictures here. Apologies. So I'm going to move on now to the Mangbetu and Azande peoples. So the Mangbetu are in the northeast part of the DRC. And this area tends to lack centralized government except for these peoples, the Mangbetu and the Azande. Although they are different people groups and they speak different languages, the Azande commission Mangbetu arts as well as having common government structures. So within the Mangbetu, women can own property traditionally, but have not typically been able to hold leadership positions. So in the 1910s, King Okondo was, I believe this is King, oh, this is King Munsa. So 1910s, the king has 180 wives. These women are status symbols. And the most famous court wife is Nenzima, who is chief wife, aide to her brother, and then she ends up ruling after her second husband dies. So Georg Schweifferth is a German botanist, and he visits the court of King Mbunza, or Munza, seen here, pictured here. And Schweifferth wrote The Heart of Africa, which was a popular book at the time. And he creates this print, which becomes very popular. And he really, really likes the Mangbetu people. He believes that they embody sophistication and beauty and order, saying that he found, quote, order, sophistication, and beauty in the heart of Africa, end quote. And he perceives the Mangbetu as superior to their neighbors. And so he brings this information back to Europe and starts a craze for the aesthetic of the Mangbetu people. So this is actually an example of European interaction with African peoples that is significantly less exploitative than what we're used to seeing throughout Africa during the age of colonization. So the Mangbetu people have art that serves as prestige items. They're utilitarian objects for the court, weapons, furniture, pottery, musical instruments, and these objects tend to be buried with an individual, so they are not heirlooms. And there is a royal art making industry. And they strive to create beautiful objects, which are tied to notions of health and ideal states of being. And one reason that they are so liked within Europe is because they tend to meet Western idea of skills, etc. So what you see here is a tattooed Mangbetu woman from 1920 to roughly 1940. And within the Mangbetu, there's a lot of attention on personal adornment. So there's this focus on the head. So unlike the objects that we looked at just a moment ago, the seat of the soul is no longer the stomach, but we're back to the head again. So this hairstyle that you see here is very popular amongst the Mangbetu at the time, although it has become significantly less popular. It's really not practiced except by the elders. And it becomes extremely famous. This is a very famous image of a Mangbetu woman who is wife to a king. And this is actually, let's see. It's actually used by the contemporary artist Carrie Mae Weems. Apologies, I should have had this pulled up before. And it's part of this series that you see here. From here, I saw what happened and I cried. And so Carrie Mae Weems is known for appropriating images from the past and juxtaposing them with text. And so you can see that the objects in between the bookends of the Mangbetu woman are images of Black people throughout, particularly the American South. And these are very, very poignant, tragic depictions of these people combined with these very deep, somber, sad words. So anyway, this is a hairstyle that has become very well known. And what this is you have basketry that creates this unique shape, this kind of sundial that you can see here, and it is attached to the head and then hair is woven over it. So you can see where this would be only the purview of royalty and the very wealthy, because it takes a lot of time to do this. And so women would purchase extra hair at the market because abundant hair is seen as beautiful and a sign of both health and wealth. And this is really symbolic of the Mangbetu culture, or at least how we perceive the Mangbetu culture in the West. And you have this elongation of the head, which blossoms out into this disc, which emphasizes and calls back to the disc of the sun, so the radiance of sun. And these are held in place with hairpins of metal or ivory, as you can see here. And so this can be an example of a prestige object, right? And you would give a hairpin to someone of the opposite sex if you were courting or flirting with them. So something else that is unique about the Mangbetu people is that traditionally, this is no longer the case, and this hairstyle is really no longer used or worn. These people practiced cranium elongation. So in the 19th century, the royalty would practice this, not everyone. But again, right, it takes time in order to do these things. And so it's a status symbol. So when a baby is born, their skull isn't knitted together. It's not fused. They have these plates, these bone plates. And so babies' heads would be wrapped in order to encourage elongation. And this is not a painful process. Unlike, say, foot binding, which most people are familiar with, which is really brutal and incapacitates the individual, preventing them from being able to walk freely, as well as often breaking bones. Cranium elongation is not painful, and although it has a lasting effect, it's not negative. So you would bind the baby's head to kind of elongate it, and you would wear this, the baby would wear it for 24 hours. You would take it off, let the head breathe for a day, put it back on. And so it goes back and forth, back and forth. So the baby is not harmed in this way. It simply causes the bone plates to knit together in a different way than it would if they were not binding the head into this shape. So this form has long been associated with the Mangbetu people in the Western perception of the Mangbetu. And so it came to be embodied within the art from the Mangbetu and eventually the Asande. So what we see here is an example of art pottery. And this starts in roughly the 1870s, and it's tourist art. So after Schweifferth's visit, the Europeans really like this elongated head, the refined face, and you would have these traditional jars that are then topped by a decorative element, this face and this head. And so the bottom is a jar, and then men would sculpt the decorative elements, and then a woman would join these pieces together and fire it. So these are not made to be used by the Mangbetu. They're tourist art. They're pretty, and they're made to be sold. And they depict the idealized Mangbetu woman. So you have this elongated head, you have this very elaborate hairstyle that we just talked about with the disc. You have facial scarification, thin protruding lips and eyes. Okay, here you can see scarification on the head. Okay, you can see that there are some piercings, which if you look at this print of the king, you can see that there is in fact a piercing through the center of the ear. So this is, again, not made for practical purposes. It is decorative and made to be sold to tourists. And so this sort of form, apologies, let me get to the form, was adopted by Magdalene Udundu. And she is a Kenyan ceramic artist. She studied in England and New Mexico, but she was very inspired by the Mangbetu head elongation and female adornment. And so she creates these ceramic vessels that mimic this sort of shape, even though they are abstract. And if you go to a museum and you see her work, it is often paired with these Mangbetu vessels. In fact, if you go to the DIA just outside the African Gallery in the big hallway, there is a Mangbetu vessel paired with one of her works. So lastly, I wanted to very briefly touch on the Azande, who are impressed with the Mangbetu art. And so first they commission art from the Mangbetu, and then they start to emulate it. And so they're most well known for these figurative harps, and they tend to be a female for the handle, with the decorated body, the elongated head, the Mangbetu hairstyle, and these are diplomatic gifts. So they would be given to Europeans, to the Azande neighbors, and used for entertainment, and as well as, again, this is an example of tourist art, prestige, but these objects were not made and used within the community and then taken from them by Westerners. These objects are explicitly made for the Western market. So a little bit different than much of what we've looked at in this class.